Hello and welcome, I'm Jay, and I'm of an age now where I'm officially allowed to say it was better in my day. And in this video, I'll give you 5 reasons why gaming was indeed better in my day. A couple of things before I start. Firstly, for context, I'm a child of the 80s and 90s, if that helps you to place what I mean by my day. The second thing is, deep down, I know that right now is the best a gamer has ever had it. With the variety of games available, the power of the hardware running them, the amazing graphics, online experiences and much more. But there are, in my opinion, few things that have been lost along the way, for various reasons. So let's cover my 5 reasons why gaming was better in my day, and let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree. Be kind though, it's just a bit of fun. Let's share our views and memories in a positive way. First on my list is the purchasing experience. I want to cover 2 things here. The first is the experience of buying a game, and the second is renting games. Let's start with those magical times when you had that bit of birthday money in your pocket, or your latest wage slip had just landed and you went out to spend your pennies wisely. I used to love going to my local Toys R Us, rest in peace, and browsing the games aisle, or going to my local Woolworths where I would later work and enjoy staff discount, and picking my way through the games, admiring the colourful and creative artwork, flipping the boxes and checking out 2 or 3 screenshots to see what the experience had in store. I would spend hours weighing up my choices and deciding which to spend my money on, going back and forth between titles, just trying to decide which way to go. I distinctly remember one Christmas trying to decide between WCW vs NWO Revenge on the N64 or Zelda the Ocarina of Time on the same console. You ask someone today, probably a no-brainer, and the answer's likely Zelda, as it's now considered an all-time great. At the time though, I didn't have that kind of knowledge, as the internet wasn't a thing. Yes kids, there once was a time before the internet, and I remember it well. At the time, I chose correctly, at least in my opinion, and I went for Zelda, which I had hours of fun with. I did eventually get the WCW title, and I loved that too, but that came later for my birthday. Now you may argue that, Jay, you can still go to a video game store and do what you're describing. And you can, of course. Now though, we have an abundance of ways to buy our games, whether it's online via an Amazon or digitally through our consoles. So the choices, they've improved, but the physical stores are often not as competitive on price, which means a lot of my shopping at least is done online these days. Also means my games just drop through my letterbox, which is less exciting, and I miss the experience of seeing all of the great games on offer and perhaps seeing something I didn't know about. I also know more about my game choices, as I have reviews and opinions at my fingertips. Another benefit, I agree, it takes some of that mystery or excitement away, as we often see too much of a game in the process of getting these opinions. Which links to another element of the buying process and another industry strangled by the internet, the Humble Games magazine. I know again you can still buy the odd game magazine today, but honestly the reasons to do so are a lot less now. Certainly for the reasons I used to buy them, which was often to find out about new games coming soon and get those precious screenshots and tidbits of information, or alternatively it was a good old cheat code, which I'll come back to later. I used to love a good magazine. Again, the selection process was similar to making the gaming choice, where to spend my pocket money. Which are the magazines to buy? Do I go Nintendo, Games Master magazine, official PlayStation, Edge? I would flick through those magazines for ages trying to decide which to go for. Often sucked in by the demo discs in the CD era. Loved a good demo disc. That could have been an entry in this list alone. I mentioned at the top though, I also wanted to talk about renting games, the days of Blockbuster or your local rental store. One of the beauties of these places was that you could head down on a Friday night after school and pick out a game for the weekend. The choice was never as vast as the video selection, and you were at the mercy of the number of copies of a given game that they had in store. But again, that selection process. Browsing the games, debating with my brother and my case over which we both wanted to play, and then agreeing on a rental and hoping again that we'd made the right choice. There's just something more tactile about the physical nature of hand-picking your video games. Much like the argument made by many readers who found Kindles to be devoid of some of the magic of owning a physical book, appreciating the art that went into the cover, enjoying the feel of turning each page. I think that with all of the streaming services and digital experiences we have today, we'll have lost some of those experiences along the way too. It's a big part of why I've gotten into collecting physical games again, both old and new in recent years. The varied box arts, the old manuals that accompanied the game, and of course the feeling of popping that cartridge or CD into the console and firing it up for the first time. Now that leads me nicely onto my second point, the experience of getting started with your games. Whether it's the first time or the 100th time, nothing aggravates me more with gaming in the modern era than load times and patches. Let's start with load times. Growing up, I was a Nintendo boy. I was very used to swapping cartridges in my NES or my SNES and eventually the N64. Not to mention the Mega Drive, Genesis for my friends across the pond. The speed at which you could pop in your game of choice, fire that console up and be into that experience just isn't an option on modern consoles. Certainly not with the big AAA titles. As we moved into the disc-based era, the likes of the PS1 and the PS2, I remember having increasingly painful load times. I don't think I was aware of them back then, but revisiting them now, they're very much a thing. I don't think I've experienced any load times though that were worse than on the PS3, specifically the beloved franchise of mine, Metal Gear Solid, and Metal Gear Solid 4. If you played this, then you'll know what I'm talking about, but watching Snake smoke that cigarette for what felt like an eternity between chapters was brutal. Now I accept things have improved, with the most recent generation of consoles powered with high-speed drives, but it's still not what it once was. I know this is due to the simple nature and overall size of the games back in the day, and I accept that's a trade-off for the grand experiences that we enjoy today. But as someone who is time poor, I do miss the simple pleasures and speed associated with those simpler arcade-like pick-up and plays. Another gripe I have with modern gaming is downloadable content in its various forms. Whether it's the initial day one patch that basically has you download the entire game again, just installed from the disc, don't get me started on installing and uninstalling games, or the constant stream of smaller updates as the game goes on that can often total multiple gigs in their own right. Again, I will keep saying it, I do understand the benefits of this process. In theory, we don't get buggy game-breaking issues committed to physical media that cannot be remedied, which although uncommon in older games, it was still present. The reality is that this capability has led to developers rushing games out unfinished and requiring these downloads to make the games playable at all in some instances. Which means that if you do own a physical copy and you want to play it in 20 years' time, it may not be achievable if those servers are no longer online to patch your day one disc version to the last supported version. A prime example of this would be Cyberpunk 2077, which on release was an absolute mess. Fast forward a couple of years and it's finally the game everyone hoped it would be, but it's changed a lot, both with bug fixes and overhauled game mechanics, meaning if you booted that game from its original disc in the future, and for some reason you can't download these latest patches, you can't experience the game at its best. I also absolutely hate it when games release with content locked on the disc as exclusive for specific version holders, where often the only thing that is downloaded is a key to allow you to access that content in the first place. I know developers often do this to make ends meet, as game prices have barely gone up since I was buying SNES games, and yet the cost of making games continues to skyrocket. It just feels like bad practice, and one that just hurts gamers who want to experience everything the developers poured their time and effort into. I think games of old that simply came with the whole experience on the cartridge or disc was a better time for everyone. My third entry on this list I'm simply calling mystery. And what I mean by this is the unknowns that came in a world before the internet. Before YouTube and Twitch streaming allowed us to experience a game before we even played it. I touched on this earlier when I mentioned magazines, and this is an extension of that point. I want to start with the humble magazines, older, better looking brother, the Strategy Guide. I loved strategy guides growing up. Whether it was Zelda Ocarina of Time, or one of the PS1 Final Fantasies, getting my hands on one of those chunky, glossy piggyback or Prima guides was a joy. And I would sit for hours with friends working through every inch of a game, unlocking the secrets, and just marvelling at the beauty of these books. I can absolutely see the argument for online guides and video playthroughs, and it's great that these are available. I do think though that not knowing everything about a game at release, or before you owned it, and having some experiences be a surprise and an unknown, is something that's been lost in today's gaming world. I know that some games still get accompanying guides, but it's not as commonplace now, and with the previous point, it's harder than ever for a guide to be truly comprehensive when games are being changed and having content added post-release. This leads me on to secrets and cheat codes. Again, often found in the covers of these guides or your favourite magazine, finding out about a secret level or a code that would get you unlimited lives was so exciting. I remember a show in the UK called Games Master, in which the Games Master himself would reveal cheat codes for a game during each episode. I would watch and wait, hoping the game for that week's episode would be one that I owned. Almost as exciting as Games Master were the playground or cafeteria conversations where friends would share their experiences as they discovered hidden items or new moves that you hadn't previously heard about. We probably all had a friend who would make up fantastical stories of such discoveries or achievements, only to be later disproven. AJ, looking at you. GTA San Andreas and the hot coffee incident was one from memory, or the long-rumoured cheat code to make a very pixelated Lara Croft naked in the original Tomb Raider. Some of them would later be proved to be real, others not so much. But those conversations and shared experiences really made these games so memorable for me. And this leads me nicely onto point number 4, playing with friends. Now I can see the comments lighting up here as people make the very good point that gaming with friends is more accessible than ever with online. And that is very true, and I've had some amazing experiences and made some great memories through online experiences. It's truly connected us as a community all across the world. But hear me out. I don't want to take away from online gaming as an experience, but I do want to talk about couch co-op and the joy of having your friends over after school or at the weekend and busting out your spare controllers or breaking out that PlayStation multitap and losing hours to the likes of Mario Kart, GoldenEye and the latest wrestling game. Maybe fighting games were your thing and you were playing Tekken, Street Fighter or some Mortal Kombat, or a sports title like FIFA or Gran Turismo, etc. Gathering together and playing games with friends is unrivaled for me. Camaraderie, the banter over a can of Coke and a takeaway pizza are some of my favourite memories growing up. And although online gives us some of that, and in some ways it gives us more, being physically together and sharing a laugh with friends is great. Personally, we would play for hours, immersing ourselves in any number of different games, depending on our mood. It was one of the reasons I remain so fond of the Nintendo 64 today. Coming out of the box, 4 control ports, which was a first for the major console makers. It set you up for those experiences, and the games on that console leaned into this. Perhaps it's why Nintendo remains to this day a console setup for in-person gatherings more so than its undercooked online experiences. I also want to mention the act of swapping or borrowing games with friends. Of course, this can still be done today if you and your friends are buying physical games. But with the advent of digital game purchases and a lot of people shifting to a digital collection, the ability to swap games has become harder, and loaning someone a title once you've finished it is just not possible. You probably all remember the Sony dig at Xbox following the launch of the Xbox One and the PS4, and although I thought it was silly at the time, I do think that social side of taking your games to a friend's house or swapping has been lost somewhat. I do remember in my youth when cash flow was not as good, but this was a great way to experience more of the gaming landscape. It also benefited your friends who also got to experience new games and kept your libraries feeling fresher during those gaps between birthdays or Christmas. Finally, I want to talk about the simplicity of older games. Again, many counter-arguments against this point, especially with the indie game scene providing experiences more similar to those we once knew. But this is more aimed at the big AAA titles and the complexity of modern game mechanics. Back in the day, game developers were limited by the hardware they had to work with. Whether that was the processing power of the console or the controller's lack of inputs, developers had to find ways to create engaging experiences with limited inputs and graphical capabilities. This meant that games were often shorter and could be completed within a few hours in some instances. But their challenge came in the replayability and harder difficulty modes. This meant that the learning curve to understand the game's buttons and mechanics was straightforward, but to master the games would take time and skill, rewarding the player for repeated play and learning how to master its challenges. With modern games, especially vast open world games, there are often complex controls, sprawling maps and character progression systems to get your head round, and as someone who's time poor these days, I often find myself starting a game but then having enforced gaps between play sessions, meaning that when I return to the game, I've often forgotten where I was in the story, new moves I'd unlocked, or locations on the map or routes to places, getting very, very frustrated. Yet I can put Mario 3 into my NES now and get immediately back into the game and be able to enjoy the experience, even if I find the later levels more challenging. I did watch an interesting video recently about ways to avoid this issue, and one of them was to journal. So at the end of a gaming session, simply making a few notes on what you've achieved in that session, where you'd been in the story and where you'd left the game at that point before you turned it off, perhaps even also adding notes on what you may be doing next when you pick it back up. I'm going to try this, as I do want to try and finish more of the games I buy, but perhaps a tip for others who struggle like me. Either way, I do find many modern games challenging to get through, and I especially don't like the newer games as a service model, which means that many games don't have a neat endpoint that you can reach, and are instead designed for that kind of constant grind and daily login. This just doesn't gel with my gaming patterns today, and I find it to be a massive turn-off, especially when it's incorporated into some of the bigger franchises that I really love. So there you have it, my list of 5 things that made gaming better in my day. I will say that I still love the games industry, and although I may harbour nostalgia for the good old days, the current gaming landscape is one of huge variety and choice, with incredibly talented developers bringing more and more amazing experiences to us all of the time. It is a really tough business to be in, and one that often treats these talented people very poorly. I do hope this changes soon, and I wanted to finish by saying a big thank you to game devs old and new for making this pastime of ours so enjoyable. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on retro gaming versus modern gaming down in the comments. If you haven't already, then please like and subscribe to the channel, as it would really help me to get more eyes on the content that I'm creating. I will see you in the next video.